This episode of New Politics was released on the 16th of November, 2024, and produced on the lands of the Wongal and Whadjuk people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, the government targeting under 16s with the social media ban. The media manipulation of Israel continues and we find out that football violence is more than acceptable. And the mainstream media gets all excited about an early election that's never going to happen. I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis, about to be announced new Archbishop of Canterbury.
Just a reminder, we don't have the billionaire owners or even the millionaire owners to support us, and that's the way that we'd like to keep it. But if you would like to support New Politics, you can do that through Patreon or Substack, or you can make a donation at newpolitics.com.au, and all of this is a good way to support independent journalism. The government is proposing to ban access to social media for all people under 16, and it's yet another ridiculous proposal put forward by the federal government. But first of all, we have to analyse what's going on here. Generally, when governments do stupid things, it's usually to create a diversion from other issues or just get the public all outraged about a particular matter, and that occupies the national conversation for a little while. And the coalition is very good at these sorts of things when they're in government, and Labor has decided that it can get into the same sorts of political tricks. And one possibility is that the government actually thinks that this is going to work, and if they do believe that, then they're even more cocooned from real life than we thought they were. And the other possibility, of course, is that they think that there are votes to be gained from this. And this is not pitched at under 16s. They can't vote anyway. It's pitched at parents of kids who probably gave their kids a mobile phone when they turned 2 and are now wondering how all of these screen time issues for their kids started off. And there's no question that social media and screen time is an issue for young children, but what the federal government is proposing is overkill. They haven't even worked out what sort of technology is going to be used to implement this. It's even questionable what is defined as social media. The Minister for Communications, Michelle Rowland, said that it would include YouTube, and that's going to make a lot of schools unhappy because they use a lot of content from YouTube for educational purposes. And this seems to be the modern version of governments wanting to ban swearing on television or ban punk rock music or ban long hair for men or telling women what to wear. And there's a whole lot of massive contradictions here. The government seems to be okay with under 16s being exposed to massive amounts of gambling advertising on free-to-air television and allowing kids as young as 10 to be locked up in adult prisons in certain jurisdictions. But when it comes to social media, they're very happy to close it down for all under 16-year-olds. So it's just going to be very interesting to see how all of this pans out, I think.
Social media is the language of most kids. And when we were young, we had the silent flicks and vaudeville to shape our language. And by language, I don't mean necessarily the slang, but the way we related to the world and the things we spoke about. Knowing who Joey from Friends was and talking about that at school the next day. Earlier Happy Days. Earlier again, things like the Brady Bunch. And I'm picking television here, that it's not the only thing, but the kids who weren't allowed to watch commercial television, say, did miss out on a lot of the conversation or the discourse, really. It's a bit more than just conversation, although we spoke about all these things. And social media provides a way for kids to talk to each other, not just online. And a lot of parents have come out and said, kids live in remote areas, my child is socially awkward, has some form of neurodivergence, which means that their major contact with the outside world is social media. I note that they said that they weren't going to ban Snapchat because that didn't count as social media under the current definitions, but they were going to ban YouTube. Now, YouTube, of course, is a social media, as you can comment on most of the videos. But as you said, it's an extremely good educational tool. You can learn anything on YouTube. It's not as good as it used to be. It's a little bit, the algorithms tend to push you away from some of the more interesting stuff and into less interesting and more ridiculous stuff. But I need to hang a door. There's a YouTube video for it. I need to play the Glass Celeste for a concert. There's a YouTube video for it. I want to learn how to write a novel. There's a YouTube video for it. And of course, this is a marvelous response. There was the maths teacher in Sydney, Eddie Wu, who made maths accessible to a lot of kids who were struggling with their normal teacher. That's not to disparage the normal teachers, by the way. Everybody has a different learning style and a different teaching style, and sometimes they're just not compatible. But Eddie Wu was able to connect maths to kids. Facebook, a lot of kids' sporting and social groups are all organised on social media. Send a message to the group, we're got to be here at this time, everyone sees it. Do we now have to ring around or write hand letters? It's a really poor piece of policy because it just hasn't been thought through.
And this started off with the state premiers. Chris Minns in New South Wales made a big push for it, as did the Premier Peter Malinauskas in South Australia. And News Corporation has run this big campaign called Let Them Be Kids, protecting our children from the social media scourge. And I think a better campaign would be to protect children from News Corporation. News Corporation has never had any interest in protecting children. They have no qualms about tapping the phones of young children or dead children. They ran a massive campaign against Greta Thunberg. They always manufacture issues that are happening at public schools that they don't like. And here they are supposedly running a campaign that they say is about protecting children, which is more likely to be protecting the interests of News Corporation. And the Prime Minister is always on board when it comes to supporting News Corporation. Here is Anthony Albanese at the media conference last week.
Today, this morning, the Minister and I have an important announcement, and this one's for the mums and dads. Social media is doing harm to our kids, and I'm calling time on it. I've spoken to thousands of parents, grandparents, aunties and uncles. They, like me, are worried sick about the safety of our kids online. And I want Australian parents and families to know that the government has your back. I want parents to be able to say, sorry mate, it's against the law for me to get you to do this. I do want to pay tribute to the campaign that's been run by media organisations on this. I do want to single out News Corp for the campaign that they've run, Let Kids Be Kids. It's an example of a media organisation being engaged in something that's of concern to the community.
And for me, this is a classic political campaign that ends up being about everything else except for the issue that it's trying to address. It's the government trying to appease News Corporation. It's the government trying to appease Peter Dutton, who's been pushing this issue over the past couple of months and now will claim some kind of victory over this. It's a vote-grabbing exercise from conservative voting parents, more likely, and it's to show legacy media that you're on their side and not on the side of social media. And I think it also continues that dynamic of governments not standing up to vested interests. And the Liberal Party I can understand because they are the party that represents vested interests and powerful interests, but we can see that the Labor government is not standing up to News Corporation. It's not standing up to gambling interests that are based here in Australia, but interests like Google and Meta, well, that's easier to act against their interests because they're based overseas, and it's easier to take on Mark Zuckerberg, who's based in California, than it is to take on the media interests in Australia because, well, essentially, if they attack social media giants, well, there's not going to be any local blowback. And I think that's the main reason why this social media ban for under 16s is coming in.
I think so. It was probably one of the more disappointing actions of Anthony Albanese's prime ministership when he praised News Corp for taking the lead in this. I don't know who he thought was going to see through it on the left and on his side of politics. And you can't win the other side of politics and keep your side, and having lost your side, expect to do well in an election. It did feel like that he was trying to butter them up. The better approach was always been, I'll call it the Keating approach, where Keating would treat journalists who asked him questions he felt were stupid with utter contempt. it seems to me that we've now got another few months at least of News Corp being able to give free kicks to the government because he's praised them. And if he goes against that, he looks contradictory and incongruous. And they're not going to give him better press. He might get a weekend with Albo and Jody spread in one of the Sunday papers. And then on Monday, it'll be back to government rorts, government inefficiency, overspending by the Labor government, and finding any angle they can to attack it. I've said this before, they're better to ignore the mainstream press. Use social media to get the message out and to kids too, and treat legacy media like it doesn't count anymore because it's lost a lot of its influence.
And this also continues that battle between legacy media and new or social media. And you could say that it's also a battle between old politics and new politics, but it is quite fashionable for the establishment to attack social media. And I'm not suggesting that it shouldn't be attacked. Twitter has become a cesspool of rubbish and Facebook is a bit of a farce anyway. But the mechanism of what social media is, I think it's totally invigorating, the bottom-up approach instead of the top-down of legacy media, the trust us, we're the journalist type of approach. And we have to remember that Twitter, in its heyday, enabled the independent reporting of the Arab Spring in the early 2010s when no one else was able to access the news. And it is still prominent in getting the reports of the atrocities being committed by Israel in Palestine, despite the best efforts of Elon Musk to stop that from happening. It was also behind the Me Too movement as well as other social movements all around the world. So social media is still very, very useful. If only we could get Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg out of the equation, things might be a little bit better. But I think overall, Albanese has got this weird contradiction on this. He's attacking social media, and I think most politicians and mainstream media journalists are quite dismissive of social media, but for a government, social media is actually difficult to control. But on the other hand, he's incredibly supportive of the mainstream media, which the government has got legislative control over, and in my opinion is a far worse problem than social media as far as their political influence and interference is concerned. And addressing legacy media in Australia would be a lot easier than trying to solve the issues related to social media. So he leaves legacy media alone, he ignores all the calls for a royal commission into the Murdoch media, or look at media diversity, or looking at issues like misinformation and disinformation in the media. And the other factor is that this is also a generation that has grown up with social media and are far more sophisticated with their understanding of technology. Their media literacy is also a lot stronger than previous generations. My son created a YouTube account when he was 10, so he could post his Minecraft videos online and communicate with all of his friends. And I think you have to be something like 13 to create a YouTube account. So he got around it, so did all of his mates at the time. And I'm sure that whatever the government does with this, people under 16 will work their way around it. And whether it's YouTube or Reddit or Discord or whatever else is coming up in social media circles, they will bypass this process. And the legislation that the government is proposing will not be enforceable. Parents or kids are not going to be punished or fined. And I think once that word gets around, most under 16s are going to ignore this age verification process. And you just have to wonder, well, what on earth is this all about? And I just wish that governments would stop wasting our time with all of this sort of nonsense.
There's a suggestion going around that it's really an excuse to introduce an ID card via stealth, because not only will people under 16 have to prove they're 16, people over 16 will have to prove that they're over 16. I don't know how true that is. I'm not sure that they've thought through the implications of this, that you have to prove your age to every social media platform. And as you said, these things are so easily subverted. One VPN, you're through. And it has echoes of the botched census of the last Liberal government, where the census became basically unusable because the data was so poorly collected. They lost a lot of it. It was corrupted. So we lost out on useful planning information, which may explain and probably goes along or some way to explaining why our infrastructure has not kept up with what's happened because they just didn't have the data. And it was like the mobile phone bans in New South Wales and South Australia. Instead of working out how can we use these tools to improve education and work with these tools because the kids are going to be using them anyway, we'll just ban them from being in schools. That made no sense to me. Yes, turn them off during class, and that teaches the etiquette of mobile phones. If you're in a cinema, if you're at a public place, you turn it off. That's, if you're in class, you turn it off. But to have a blanket ban when the telephone has become a vital part of everyday life seems to me to be redundant and recessive. So I think it's another poorly thought through policy aimed at getting a vote that they're not really going to get, and at people who don't understand the power and the strength and the positivity or the potential positivity of social media. A lot of bad things happen on social media, absolutely. But a blanket ban for everyone under the age of 16 is, I think, throwing the baby out with the bathwater after you've bolted the gate when the horse is gone. It's overkill.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, the best podcast on Australian politics and news commentary. You can support us through Patreon and Substack, and also find us at newpolitics.com.au.
Lying around waiting to die, never did quite satisfy. A siren song, sugar tongue, so easily undone. Clever enough to know the score. Beg you to stop, you say what for? My dark angel, won't you drag those nails across my soul?
For the children! I'll give you my money! Free Palestine now!
Cowering on the ground, an Israeli soccer fan apparently terrorized.
Take my money! You want to kill kids?
His attacker yelling, "For the kids! Free Palestine!" This unverified social media video claims to be from Amsterdam last night. This night of violence, marked by multiple attacks, groups of men beating other men after a football game between a visiting Israeli team and a local club. Called anti-Semitic by Dutch leaders and Israeli officials, police told fans to hide.
It was really, really terrifying.
In the run-up to the game, there were clashes between Israeli fans and pro-Palestinian protesters. Pro-Israel supporters chanted "Death to the Arabs." Others pulled down a Palestinian flag. Anger rose as Israeli supporters in yellow disrespected a moment of silence.
We had yet another example of the media and Australian political leaders totally manipulating the public and denying the truth when it comes to Israel. And this time it was over an event that occurred in Amsterdam when football hooligans from the Israeli football club Maccabi Tel Aviv caused riots in the city when their team played the Dutch team, Ajax. And they shouted anti-Arab slurs, approached anyone of Middle Eastern appearance and beat them up. They tore down Palestinian flags, incited and caused violence, and started shouting anti-Palestinian abuse during a 1-minute silence for all the victims who had died during the recent floods in Spain. So, in other words, they thought that they were in the West Bank. And the following day, when they continued their violence and provocation on the streets of Amsterdam, Dutch people retaliated against these Israeli hooligans. And this is the news that was reported internationally, that it was Jewish people being targeted just for being Jewish. It was anti-Semitic behaviour by the people of Amsterdam. It was a pogrom. It was a repeat of the Kristallnacht from 1938. And this was reported by the international Western media and condemned by political leaders all around the world, including from Australia's Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, who said that the anti-Semitic attacks on Israeli soccer fans in Amsterdam are abhorrent and that her thoughts are with those affected and their families. There was no commentary at all about the cause of the issue, that it was instigated by Israeli football hooligans. And through independent media sources and social media, the truth of what did actually happen finally came out. And the mainstream media then stopped their reporting of the entire event, but political leaders then continued with the same narrative that we have to do whatever we can to stop anti-Semitism. Now, of course, we have to stop anti-Semitism. There's absolutely no question about this, but we also have to stop all forms of racism. But people like Penny Wong were condoning violence against Arab people and Palestinians and supported the perpetrators of the violence in this instance, the Israeli football hooligans. And for sure, this was just a football match, but it's a replica of what's going on within Palestine. And the actions of Israel are just never held to account. The actions of Palestinians are always condemned. It doesn't matter what it is. And that's exactly what happened in Amsterdam during the week.
It was strange. And maybe I heard about it late, but I knew before Penny Wong had released her statement, it wasn't as clear-cut as Dutch people going after Jewish people, that it was actually the supporters of the Israeli football team acting appallingly. The British hooliganism, that's just as bad. When you have the riots in Spain and South America, that's just as bad. To couch it in that way suggested an Israeli media trying to get ahead of the story, but ignoring that you can't shut these stories down. And it wasn't just people saying, oh, that didn't happen, which can be dismissed. It was also video showing exactly what was happening. And I think the main person to sort of break it was a 13-year-old Dutch kid who videoed it and explained what was going on, a little bit like Channel 6 News here, run by teenagers. And that might take us back to why they don't want kids on social media. It ruins their narrative. It was such a humiliating thing for Penny Wong to be caught up in. I know that she's got to toe particular lines. I'm also told that she has been working behind the scenes to try and change Australia's position. And Australia voted with 157 other nations at the United Nations. It was to recognise the permanency of Palestinian territory. And so it looks like Australian attitudes are starting to soften, which may be too little too late, but at least it's something. So, yeah, baby steps and all of that. But, yeah, Senator Wong did humiliate herself, as did David Lammy, the British Foreign Secretary, in trying to defend this stuff when it was clearly not what they were told, which a quick look on Google would have shown the real story.
And it's like the entire political class and political leadership is in la-la land. You know, billions and billions of US dollars going towards helping Israel bomb Palestine to smithereens, while people in the US are homeless, without jobs, or working poor with cost of living pressures. And there might not be a direct correlation, but some of these factors would have led to the defeat of the Democrats in the US election. And Joe Biden is still continuing to fund more and more ammunitions and bombs for Israel. And with this incident in Amsterdam, and we have to remember that every incident of football hooliganism ever since football began has been punished and reprimanded in one way or another. English teams were banned for 5 years from playing in Europe after the Heysel disaster in 1985. Authorities have tried to stamp it out for many, many years, and I think with great success. The English Premier League currently has a No Room for Racism campaign throughout every game of the season, and here we have thousands of Israelis in another country hurling racist abuse, committing the violence that the game has been trying to stamp out for a very, very, very long time. Other clubs and countries are banned, but when it comes from supporters of Israel, well, they can act with impunity and there's no ban for Israel.
It's clear that the information gathering wing, let's call them Mossad, have something over a lot of world leaders, the way that they just fold, in the way that they don't fold to other countries. But nonetheless, we're seeing a lot of inconsistencies in how some nations are treated as to others. All nations should be treated the same. Your fans start fights, start riots, generally ruin it. Is it fair to those players who'd spent years to get to international representation to have that stripped away from them? Not really, but it is appropriate because the fans are there supposedly to enjoy football and make sure that everybody else enjoys football. And that's on every fan. And that's how the punishment goes. And it must be devastating. You've finally got your way into the international team and then told that the international team is banned. But if the fans aren't playing within the spirit of the game, I don't know that there's much other choice.
And it's been pointed out that while this is a football game, it's so indicative of the genocide that's being committed by Israel. And a few people have said, oh, well, you know, you couldn't call it a genocide. That's a bit extreme. Well, that's exactly what it is. Many countries around the world are calling Israel's actions in Gaza a genocide. And just last week, Ireland, that's not an Arab country, that's a part of Europe and a country that's not dissimilar to ours, they passed a resolution saying, yes, Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. So it's not just us being radical ratbags. This is what many governments around the world can see with their own eyes, but it's something that Australian political leaders and the mainstream media here is either ignoring or telling outright lies about what's going on there. And there's hundreds of Palestinians being killed every day, famine caused by Israel, and now preparations by Israel to annex the West Bank. The bombs are going off every single day, but despite what we can see through independent media sources, politicians in the West and their mainstream media friends deny what's happening. It's all totally ignored. The United States has been saying that there's no violation. Israel says that the claims of famine are false. The US government makes an ultimatum to Israel, but it doesn't follow through when that day comes. And our foreign minister just bleats stuff about being deeply concerned, like a broken record, and overlooks atrocities committed by Israel and condemns anti-Semitism. But as far as I'm concerned, the mask is really off. We're seeing the true face of all of these people. We're seeing the true face of Western politicians, seeing the true face of people like Penny Wong. We're seeing the true face of Zionism, and it really, really is an ugly face. It's truly barbaric, and we can see what's going on. Whether it's in the streets of Amsterdam or the suburbs of Gaza, we can see exactly what's going on, yet the manipulation and the denials from everyone else just seems to be continuing.
Yeah, and I guess we should make it clear again that our criticism is directed at the Israeli government as led by Benjamin Netanyahu, not by the many Israeli citizens who oppose it too. And I think that's important to remember and to remind people of, because passions run high. It's very easy to misunderstand, but it's not wrong to criticise the government doing wrong things.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
Under the weathered white skies of humiliation. Under the weathered white skies of humiliation.
The media has started going into a bit of a frenzy about an early election, and it was primarily started off by journalists at the ABC, which continues its fast downward slide as a reputable news source. And this was after the Prime Minister was in Tasmania to announce two candidates for the Labor Party in the seats of Lyons and Braddon, and was asked about the prospects of an early election.
The speculation around elections is something that has been, I've read in the August pages of our national tabloid. The date was going to be August 30, and then it was September, then it's December 7. What I've been focused on is governing. I've been focused on my government's objectives, which have been, when we came to office, we had inflation with a 6 in front of it and was rising. Inflation now has a 2 in front of it and is falling. We've done that while providing cost of living support, including a tax cut for every taxpayer that was opposed by the coalition, energy bill relief, cheaper medicines, fee-free TAFE, all of which were opposed by the coalition. We've done that as well while 1 million jobs have been created during this term of office. More jobs than any government in Australian history since Federation, and real wages are increasing. So we've been dealing with those immediate pressures whilst setting Australia up for the brighter future that we can have.
And that noise that you could hear in the background was from the Save the Maugean Skate campaigners trying to save yet another endangered species, and that's a fish that looks a little bit like a stingray and is quickly heading towards extinction. Thought that I should just throw that in. But it's not really clear why this push from some parts of the media for an early election is happening, because it is futile speculation and low-level reporting. These reporters haven't outlined why a Prime Minister would call an election for mid-December when no one is actually listening into politics. They also previously suggested an election date of January the 26th when absolutely no one is listening to anything and most of Australia is still asleep. And we still think that the next election will be held in May next year. We've been saying that for a long, long time. And there's also some technical issues related to boundary changes, which will be more favourable to the federal government if the election is held after early April next year. So is it because these journalists are uninformed or underinformed? Who knows? But it might be a case of just trying to create news when the news just doesn't exist.
Australian media loves elections. They're easy to talk about. A lot of content is generated. It's a thing that can be couched in terms that the capital A, average, capital P, punter, trademark, copyright can understand. And journalists don't have to do a lot of hard work. A policy is announced, you report it, and then you trash it or you praise it depending on what side of politics you support. Much harder is policy analysis, the day-to-day business of government. And so election speculation is a way of keeping journalists off the hard work of policy, except for things like the social media ban, which is easy. But things like a new treaty between Australia and Brazil, which is a trade treaty, say, and what's involved and who benefits and what are the gains and what's the losses, is a hard thing, particularly as Brazil isn't a major trading partner. It is a trading partner, not a major one like China is. Looking at welfare benefits for veterans and who gets what, and it's hard work for a journalist to file through the hundreds of submissions and to see that there's been a $25 increase in welfare benefits and who this benefits and who this. Whereas an election, you can have your good side, your bad side. You can wait for the slogans to come through. You can get in your analysts to talk about who's going to win and who's not going to win. And it's all very nice, and it allegedly sells papers and attracts viewers' eyes and ears. It doesn't seem that it does.
And economists are suggesting that there's likely to be an interest rate cut before the next election. And if that happens, in combination with lower inflation, 2 surplus budgets in a row, well, I think that's a really good economic story to run with. But remembering that this seems to be a government that never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity on telling the public about all the good things that they're doing. But whether they don't do this, I think at least it neutralises a negative media narrative against the Labor government on economics. And then, of course, it's a matter of whether the public accepts this narrative or not. And after the victory of Donald Trump in the United States, it's been suggested that Peter Dutton now has the wind in his sails and he'll win the next federal election. Now, the problem here is that there's no doubt that Peter Dutton is a populist, but he's an ugly populist. And whatever we think about Donald Trump, he's got engagement value. He's an ugly populist with charisma, and people could listen to and watch him all day long. Peter Dutton just hasn't got that attention factor. And if Dutton got up and danced for 45 minutes on stage like Donald Trump did during the US presidential campaign, well, people would look at that and think, well, God, that's a bit bloody weird. And Trump did go onto the Joe Rogan Experience podcast and spoke for 3 hours, and people were just mesmerised by this guy. And if Peter Dutton booked 3 hours with us on New Politics, well, we'd probably run out of things to talk about after 5 minutes, and all of our subscribers would cancel. So Dutton just doesn't have those qualities, if you want to call them that. And this doesn't mean that Peter Dutton hasn't got the capacity to win an election. We have to remember that in Australia, we do have a habit of electing totally incompetent people as Prime Minister. Tony Abbott, well, Scott Morrison come to mind. So you cannot exclude Peter Dutton just on that basis. But he just doesn't have a clear pathway to victory as far as the electoral numbers are concerned. And it is that big buffer between Labor and the Liberal National Party caused by the size of the crossbench, and that's 17 at the moment, and that's the biggest crossbench in Federation, and it's also the biggest problem for Peter Dutton getting elected. Not because he's an idiot, because fools and idiots do tend to get elected in Australia, but that buffer between Labor and the LNP, that's his biggest problem.
He's either going to have to win a lot of Labor seats, which isn't totally impossible, but the Labor will lose those seats over policies that Dutton agrees with, so it's unlikely they will go with a Liberal. They are more likely to go Green or independent, and a lot of them are going to be retained anyway. This isn't rah-rah Labor, yes. This is just looking at through the cold eye of realism and probability. The other pathway he has, of course, is winning back prior blue ribbon seats like Wentworth, North Sydney, Kooyong, etc. A lot of those teal independents aren't going anywhere. I know that some of them, not all, some of them have disappointed listeners of New Politics through their attitude towards the Middle East and Gaza, and I share that disappointment. But those seats aren't going back to Liberal, and I don't think there are strong enough independents to take a lot of them. The 17 or I've seen counts as high as 22 to make it convincing seats that Peter Dutton has to win, I think, is unattainable. This isn't like the Queensland election where the Labor Party went from 7 seats to landslide majority either. The government, while it's been underperforming in a lot of people's eyes, hasn't been underperforming that badly, whereas the Newman government was a disaster for Queensland. Also, preferential voting means that I don't think at this point, I think it will be a minority Labor government, but I haven't started looking at the indications deeply yet either. So I've looked at enough to think that I just cannot see how the Liberal Party can get to a position of even minority government at the next election. And if they get to a position where they can negotiate, I don't know that those with the balance of power will go with a Dutton government. But that's pure speculation and remains to be seen.
And we are getting closer to the next federal election, just not as close as the media would like us to believe, but the opinion polls are still in favour of the Liberal National Party, and the latest news poll has them in front at 51% of the two-party preferred vote, and this would normally be an election-winning position, but because of the large crossbench, it's not. They still have to win 21 seats overall to form government and maybe take about 12 seats off the Labor Party to get into a position where they might be able to patch up a minority government. Elections are always unpredictable, but the final 6 months of a parliamentary term is usually when a government ramps up its re-election strategy, and we will see a lot more political action and activity in the first part of 2025, but there's just so many factors to take into account. Will the Australian Greens hang on to those 4 seats that they currently hold, or will they pick up more? And there are some good quality independent candidates supported through the Climate 200 group. There's also that downward trajectory of the primary vote for the major parties, and that's gone down steadily since 1983, and it's never gone back up at any election since that time. And David, this year is not over yet. There's still a short time to go, but this is almost like the calm before the storm. But it should set us up for some very interesting final 6 months of this parliamentary term.
For sure. And miracles do happen. Lazarus with a triple bypass, he might get the 4th one done for Dutton. I just can't see the path that he takes to get there. But certainly the next 6 months, we're going to see 2 major parties in desperation. We're going to see an emboldened Greens, an emboldened Nationals. Nationals will keep their 12 or 13 seats. They might lose 1 or 2. Peter Dutton might win a few of those seats we're talking about, by the way. I don't want to say that he's not going to win at all, but I think he's not going to win 22. He might win 4 or 5 or 6. And let's be fair, that's a very good result for them.
And governments since 1931 have always had their second term. There have been some near misses recently in 1998, 2010 and 2016. You could argue that 2019 was also a near miss, but the second term always seems to somehow fall into place. The issue for Albanese is that the 2022 election victory itself was only a narrow victory, and to counteract that is the large crossbench that we spoke about before that creates a big problem for Peter Dutton. But it's also a question of whether any current anti-government sentiment affects all of those Teal independents who won seats off the Liberal Party in 2022, and remembering that it was more of an anti-Liberal Party vote in 2022 than anti-Labor. And I'd say that if they were unlikely to vote for Scott Morrison in all of those seats in 2022, they'd be less likely to vote for a Dutton-led Liberal Party in 2025. And there's also the polling numbers for the Australian Greens. That's currently around the same level as the 2022 federal election. But as we saw in the recent Queensland election, the Greens can keep the same general vote across Australia and even increase the primary vote in the seats that they hold and still lose a seat. So we have to be mindful of a repeat of that happening federally, but I'd say that if the Labor government plays its cards right and also plays hard politics, it will win the 2025 election. But that's always going to be the big question. It had a soft victory and a narrow victory in 2022, and it's got that unusual situation of having to improve its vote at its first attempt of re-election. So it's just really hard to say at this stage.
Yeah, I'm certainly not going to call anything till a lot closer to the election. And
well, you don't want to gazump Anthony Green at this stage.
No, we'll work it out.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.